"You're blocking our ocean view with your filth." The words hung in the air like poison, slicing through the gentle sound of waves. Miguel's weathered hands trembled slightly as he clutched his fishing rod, an extension of himself for over 60 years. Around him, designer sunglasses reflected his humiliation back in perfect symmetry, while champagne glasses clinked in appreciation of the security guard now approaching. The old fisherman stood motionless on the shore where his father had taught him to cast lines before this stretch of paradise was sectioned off, priced, and sold to people who believed even the horizon could be purchased. None of the lounging guests noticed the man in the faded baseball cap at the edge of the bar, lowering his drink as his eyes narrowed beneath designer sunglasses. The Azure Bay Resort had transformed this once public beach into an exclusive paradise where cabanas rented for more than Miguel's monthly income. White uniforms glided between lounge chairs, delivering colorful cocktails to tanned bodies that had never worked beneath the sun. The resort manager, Andre Wilton, a man whose suit cost more than a fishing boat, approached with practiced disdain. His smile never reached his eyes as he gestured toward the private property sign. For 3 generations, Miguel's family had cast their nets here, but now invisible lines separated those who belonged from those who didn't. Phones emerged from designer bags, recording what promised to be social media entertainment. The removal of an unwanted element from their curated experience. "Sir, I need you to leave immediately. This is a private beach for our guests only." The security guard's hand hovered near Miguel's shoulder, not quite touching. Contamination by association was still contamination. Laughter rippled through the audience of wealthy spectators, the kind that came easily to those who'd never been the punchline. Miguel's dignity was evaporating under the merciless sun as he began gathering his simple equipment, each movement heavy with defeat. What nobody realized, as drinks were refreshed and conversations resumed, was that the man in the faded cap was rising from his seat. Johnny Depp, whose presence had been deliberately unannounced at the resort, was about to rewrite the ending to their afternoon entertainment. Miguel Sanchez had risen before dawn for 63 years to meet the sea. The water knew him better than most people did. It had witnessed his first catch at 7, celebrated his marriage when he brought his bride to this shore, and comforted him when he scattered his wife's ashes beyond the reef 5 years ago. His calloused hands bore the story of a life devoted to honest work, each line earned through storms and sunrises no resort guest would ever witness. The beach beneath his feet was more than sand. It was his heritage, his workplace, and the only constant in a changing world that increasingly had no place for men like him. The Azure Bay Resort had materialized like a mirage 18 months ago. The developers had promised local employment, but delivered imported staff with European accents instead. They'd promised beach access for locals, but installed security cameras and guards. They'd promised to respect the environment, but dredged the coral to create a perfect swimming area. Now the resort stood as a gleaming monument to exclusivity, its white facade reflecting sunlight with the same intensity as the manager's smile reflected contempt. Andre Wilton had perfected the art of removing undesirables while maintaining impeccable customer service ratings. His British accent added authority to rejections as he managed a property that catered to those who expected reality itself to be edited for their comfort. "This is simply unacceptable," muttered a woman whose diamond necklace caught the sunlight aggressively. "We're paying $1,200 a night for this view." Her husband nodded, scrolling through his phone without looking up, his outrage performed purely for the benefit of those around him. Another guest, a man with a chest chronically puffed with self-importance, loudly proclaimed, "They should build a wall or something. This isn't what the brochure promised." Miguel understood enough English to comprehend their disgust. His weathered face remained impassive, a skill learned through decades of hiding emotions from fish that could sense fear through water. But inside, shame burned hot and familiar. This wasn't the first time the world had reminded him he was invisible, except when he was an inconvenience. "I fish here 40 years before hotel," Miguel said quietly, his accent thick, but his meaning clear. "Sea not belong to anyone." The security guard, a young man named Thomas, whose muscles were developed in gyms rather than through work, shifted uncomfortably. Unlike the manager, he was local enough to recognize Miguel, to have eaten fish perhaps caught by those very hands. But a job was a job, and empathy was a luxury he couldn't afford while wearing that uniform. "Policy is policy, sir," Thomas said, his voice caught between authority and reluctance. "Please don't make this difficult." The man in the faded cap had been observing the scene with growing interest. Johnny Depp had chosen this resort specifically for its promise of anonymity, paying a premium for the management's assurance that he would be treated as just another wealthy guest. No autographs, no photographs, no special attention. Ironic, he thought, that they extended such courtesy to celebrities while denying basic dignity to a man who actually belonged here. The actor watched as Andre Wilton approached, the manager's smile transitioning from customer service to cruel satisfaction. Andre placed himself between Miguel and the guests, his back to the fisherman, as if he were already gone. "I do apologize for this disruption to your afternoon," Andre announced to his audience. "Rest assured, our beach will remain exclusive and pristine. We value the experience we've promised you." His eyes swept over the approving faces of those whose validation paid his salary. Behind his sunglasses, Johnny's eyes hardened. He recognized the performance unfolding, a public humiliation choreographed for the entertainment of the privileged. How many times had he played characters on both sides of this dynamic? The pirate, the outsider, the man society rejected. But this wasn't a script with predetermined outcomes. This was real life, with real consequences for a man whose only crime was existing in a space that had been rebranded beyond his economic reach. Johnny set his untouched drink on the bar, the ice clinking against glass in what sounded remarkably like decision. He stood, adjusting his cap lower over his eyes, and began moving toward the growing spectacle, not as Captain Jack Sparrow or any other character, but as a human being who'd seen enough. Miguel began collecting his meager belongings with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to indignities. His tackle box, dented, rusted at the edges, but meticulously organized inside, closed with a click that seemed to punctuate the end of an era. Each item he gathered represented not just equipment, but heritage. The weighted net had been his father's, the knife sheathed at his belt, a gift from his son before the boy left for the mainland, in search of opportunities this changing coastline could no longer provide. "Perhaps we should call actual security," suggested a man in a polo shirt embroidered with a small horse, loud enough for Miguel to hear. "He looks like he might be unstable." The implication hung in the air, that poverty and age were somehow threatening, that a life lived honestly could be reframed as dangerous when it didn't match the aesthetic of luxury. Andre Wilton nodded in practiced concern. "We have everything under control, sir. Your safety is our priority." The lie was smooth. There was no threat to manage, only a perception to maintain. The perception that this resort was a bubble where reality could be filtered, where the authentic culture of the region could be sampled without the inconvenience of its people. A young woman, perhaps 25, was filming the entire interaction on her phone, her expression caught between amusement and uncertainty. The hashtags were already forming in her mind. Number sign, beach drama. Number sign, vacation. Fail number sign, local color. The human being at the center of her content was irrelevant, except as a character in her social media narrative. Thomas, the security guard, felt sweat gathering at his collar that had nothing to do with the heat. "Sir," he said to Miguel, softer now, "my supervisor is coming. Please ... The unfinished sentence contained both warning and apology. Miguel looked up at the resort that now dominated the coastline of his ancestors. Its pristine white walls stood in stark contrast to his village's fading pastel homes just beyond the property line. The invisible boundary between these worlds had never felt more insurmountable. "This beach, remember me when all of you forget," Miguel said, his voice low but carrying across the suddenly attentive audience. There was neither anger nor pleading in his tone, only the weight of truth that required no embellishment. Johnny Depp moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to being seen too much. His approach was casual, unhurried, as if he were simply changing positions for better sun. The other guests, engrossed in the spectacle of Miguel's removal, barely registered his movement. This was the true currency of privilege, the ability to choose when to be noticed. Andre Wilton was now standing directly in front of Miguel, his back a perfect wall of expensive linen separating the unwanted fisherman from the valuable guests. "I'll handle this personally," he said to Thomas, dismissing the younger man with a subtle nod. The resort manager's posture shifted, authority hardening his spine as he turned to face Miguel. "Mr. Sanchez," Andre said, confirming he knew exactly who he was removing, "we've discussed this before. This property is privately owned now. Your traditions will need to find another location." His tone suggested he was being remarkably patient with something unreasonable. Miguel's eyes, clear despite his 70 years, met Andre's without flinching. "Before your concrete, my grandfather fish here. Before your umbrella, my father teach me tides here. The sea no difference between visitor and home." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the watching guests. The inconvenience was becoming entertainment, the kind of exotic local color they could relate at dinner parties back home. "I think it's sweet," said a woman whose rhinoplasty had left her with a perpetually surprised expression. "But rules are rules." Johnny paused at the edge of the scene, absorbing the dynamic. He'd played enough characters to recognize the narrative being constructed, the outdated local refusing progress, the efficient management maintaining standards, the appreciative audience validating the status quo. It was a story as old as colonization itself, repackaged in resort brochure language. "If not today, tomorrow I return," Miguel said, his dignity a rebuke to the scene unfolding around him. "Fish have no passport, water have no owner." Andre's professional veneer cracked slightly, irritation bleeding through. "Actually, this water does have an owner. The property line extends 300 meters into the bay, and trespassing—" His voice rose to ensure the audience could hear his decisive handling of the situation — "is still illegal, regardless of how long your family has been trespassing." The word hung in the air, a deliberate recategorization of heritage into crime. Around them, several phones recorded the exchange, digital witnesses to an ancient conflict between those who buy the world and those who live in it. Andre's hand was now on Miguel's shoulder, a gesture that appeared helpful to observers, but contained unmistakable pressure. "Let me escort you to the public beach access point. It's only a mile down the coast." The suggestion was presented as courtesy, but landed as cruelty. A mile of rocky shoreline would be challenging for a young man, let alone someone of Miguel's age carrying fishing equipment. The watching crowd had grown, resort guests magnetized by the promise of conflict. A child, no more than 7, tugged at her mother's designer cover-up. "Why can't the old man stay and fish, Mommy?" The clarity of the question cut through the manufactured atmosphere of adult justifications. "Because we're paying to not have to think about people like that on vacation," the mother replied, not quite quietly enough, before ushering her daughter toward the resort pool where reality was better chlorinated. Johnny Depp removed his sunglasses, tucking them into his shirt pocket. The gesture was small but significant, a decision to be recognized. He stepped forward, the crowd parting unconsciously before his familiar presence. Celebrity created its own gravity, pulling attention away from Miguel's humiliation and toward this unexpected development. "Excuse me," Johnny said, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence that had delivered some of cinema's most memorable lines. Heads turned, expressions shifted from contemptuous amusement to shocked recognition. The woman filming lowered her phone, then raised it again with renewed purpose. This was no longer just speech drama, this was Johnny Depp content. Andre Wilton froze, his hand still on Miguel's shoulder. The manager's mind raced through protocols for handling celebrity interventions, a situation covered in training but rarely encountered. His expression performed a complicated dance between continued authority over Miguel and deferential respect toward Johnny. "Mr. Depp," Andre managed, his voice climbing half an octave, "I didn't realize you were... Is there something I can assist you with?" The question attempted to redirect the interaction, to reestablish Andre as facilitator rather than obstacle. Miguel stood still, dignity intact, despite the hand on his shoulder. He didn't recognize the actor, seeing only another resort guest, perhaps kinder than most, but still part of the world that was erasing his. "Actually," Johnny said, stepping fully into the circle that had formed around the confrontation, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about who's trespassing on what." His eyes, which had played pirates and outcasts and mad hatters, now held something entirely authentic, the gaze of a man who recognized injustice and had decided to do something about it. The resort guests' phones were all raised now, recording what promised to be a viral moment, though not the one they had anticipated minutes earlier. The power in the scene had shifted, the narrative destabilized by the wild card of celebrity intervention. Whatever happened next would not follow the resort's carefully choreographed script. Johnny approached Miguel with the relaxed confidence that had defined his most beloved characters, extending his hand in greeting. "The fishing any good around here?" he asked, ignoring Andre, and addressing Miguel directly, as if they were the only two people on the beach. The question, simple, genuine, reframed the entire confrontation. Miguel's weathered face remained serious as he evaluated the stranger. A lifetime of assessing people as quickly as changing tides had given him an instinct for authenticity. "Was better before they break the reef," he answered honestly, nodding toward the resort's artificially cleared swimming area. "But the snappers still come with evening tide." Andre Wilton stepped between them, a physical manifestation of the social barrier he was employed to maintain. "Mr. Depp, I apologize for this situation. We're simply enforcing property boundaries for the comfort of all our guests." His voice had regained its professional smoothness, but his eyes darted nervously between Johnny and the growing crowd of onlookers. "Comfort," Johnny repeated, as if testing the word for truth. He looked around at the meticulously landscaped beach, the imported palm trees positioned for maximum aesthetic appeal, the sand raked into perfect patterns each morning, the absence of any authentic connection to the place itself. Interesting definition of comfort. The guests had formed a loose semicircle, their attention now fully diverted from Miguel to Johnny. Their expressions ranged from excited recognition to calculated assessment of how this celebrity encounter might translate to social media currency. Several had abandoned their typical restraint around famous people and were openly filming the interaction. "I'm staying in the oceanfront villa," Johnny continued, addressing Andre but loud enough for everyone to hear. "The one that costs, what is it, $5,000 a night?" The figure hung in the air, simultaneously impressive and obscene against the backdrop of Miguel's weathered tackle box. Andre's smile tightened. "The presidential suite, yes. And we're honored to have you with us, Mr. Departamento. Perhaps we could discuss any concerns you have privately?" His hand gestured toward the resort buildings, attempting to relocate the confrontation away from public view. "I'm actually pretty comfortable right here," Johnny replied, removing his cap to run a hand through his hair, a gesture familiar to anyone who had watched interviews with the actor. The movement confirmed beyond doubt his identity to any remaining skeptics in the crowd. A murmur rippled through the audience, punctuated by the distinctive sounds of social media notifications as the first images began circulating. Miguel watched the exchange with quiet dignity, still unsure why this guest was involving himself, but recognizing the shift in dynamics. For 60 years, the sea had taught him to recognize changing currents. This was one such moment, unpredictable, powerful, and potentially dangerous. "So," Johnny said, turning back to Miguel with deliberate casualness, "you've been fishing these waters for what, 50 years?" 63, Miguel answered, a quiet pride in his voice. "Since I was 7 years? My father teach me here." He gestured toward the water with a slight nod, his connection to the place evident in the ease of the movement. Johnny whistled softly in appreciation. 63 years? That's longer than I've been alive." He turned to address the gathered crowd, his expression thoughtful. "That's longer than this resort has existed, longer than most of the businesses that own pieces of this coastline." His voice carried naturally, years of acting allowing him to project without seeming to raise his volume. Andre stepped forward again, professional smile straining at the edges. "While we respect local history, Mr. Depp, the current reality is that Azure Bay Resort has legal ownership of this beachfront. We have all the necessary permits and—" "Legal ownership," Johnny interrupted, the words measured and contemplative rather than confrontational. "Interesting concept. Tell me, how long has your resort owned this beach?" The question, simple and direct, created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Andre cleared his throat. "The property was acquired and developed 18 months ago following all proper—" 18 months versus 63 years, Johnny said, letting the mathematics speak for itself. He turned toward the guests, his expression open and engaging, the look that had charmed audiences for decades. "I'm curious, when you all checked in, did they mention that this resort was built on fishing grounds that have supported local families for generations?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A woman in a designer swimsuit spoke up, her voice defensive but uncertain. "Well, that's progress, isn't it? Everything was something else before." Johnny nodded thoughtfully. "True, very true. Everything has a before. But I wonder—" He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. "If progress has to mean forgetting." Miguel stood straighter, his eyes moving between Johnny and the audience with new understanding. This wasn't just intervention, it was invitation, to see him as human rather than obstacle. Andre's professional demeanor cracked further. "Mr. Depp, while we appreciate your concern, we have a responsibility to maintain the exclusive environment our guests have paid for." The word "paid" carried extra weight, a reminder of the transactional nature of belonging in this space. "Exclusive," Johnny repeated, as if examining the word, from the Latin excludere, to shut out. He smiled, but the expression held no humor. "I've always found it interesting how we measure the value of places by who they keep away, rather than who they welcome." Around them, the previously dismissive expressions of resort guests had begun to shift. Discomfort replaced certainty. Questions replaced assumptions. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, and they found themselves cast in roles less flattering than they had anticipated. Johnny turned back to Miguel, his manner shifting from performative to personal. "Would you mind showing me how you fish here? What makes this spot special?" The question was genuine, an acknowledgement of expertise rather than a request for entertainment. Miguel studied Johnny's face for a moment, then nodded slowly. With careful movements, he extended his fishing rod, pointing toward a section of water about 30 yards offshore. "There," he said, "where dark water meets light. Current brings small fish, then bigger fish come." His knowledge was precise, specific to this exact location, knowledge no property deed could contain. Johnny listened with evident interest, then addressed the crowd again. "You know, in all the films I've made, I've played pirates, gangsters, Native Americans, chocolate makers, but I've learned that the most interesting people are rarely the ones in the spotlight." He gestured toward Miguel. "This man knows things about this bay that no resort brochure will ever tell you." Andre stepped forward, desperation now visible beneath his professional veneer. "Mr. Depp, as a valued guest, we would be happy to arrange a private cultural experience if you're interested in local fishing techniques. Our concierge can—" "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Johnny interrupted, his voice still conversational, but carrying an edge now. "You want to package people's lives and heritage as experiences while removing the actual people from the landscape. That's not culture, that's taxidermy." The metaphor landed with uncomfortable precision. Several guests looked away, suddenly fascinated by the pattern of sand beneath their feet or the distant horizon. The woman who had been filming lowered her phone slightly, her expression troubled. Miguel placed his tackle box on the sand with deliberate care. "My grandfather say, sea belonged to itself. We only borrow time with it." The philosophy, delivered without pretension, carried more weight than any legal argument about property rights. Johnny nodded, then did something unexpected. He removed his shoes. The simple act drew all eyes back to him as he set the expensive leather loafers aside and stepped barefoot onto the sand. "Miguel," he said, "would you honor me by showing me exactly where to stand to cast properly in this current?" The invitation was clear, not just to teach fishing techniques, but to reclaim space, to assert belonging through practice rather than permission. Miguel's eyes widened slightly in recognition of what was being offered. Andre moved forward again, panic now visible beneath his professional mask. "Mr. Depp, for liability reasons, we can't allow fishing activities outside our organized—" "I'll sign a waiver," Johnny interrupted casually. "And I'll be sure to mention in my social media posts what a culturally authentic experience Azure Bay Resort provided by connecting me with a true local expert." His eyes met Andre's with perfect understanding. He was offering both threat and opportunity in the same package. The calculus was visible on Andre's face as he processed this new scenario. The potential publicity value of Johnny Depp praising the resort versus the damage of him criticizing it. The manager's training had never covered this particular situation. A guest with more power than the establishment itself, choosing to align with the very element the resort had been designed to exclude. The transformation began subtly, a shifting energy across the beach as the narrative realigned. Andre's defeated nod signaled capitulation, though he maintained a tight smile as he stepped aside. "Of course, Mr. Departamento, whatever makes your stay memorable." The words were correct, but the tone hollow, a script without conviction. Miguel hesitated only briefly before nodding in return. With practiced movements that carried decades of muscle memory, he began to demonstrate the proper stance for casting in these particular waters. Johnny followed his instructions with genuine attention, his celebrity momentarily secondary to his role as student. Around them, the atmosphere among the resort guests transformed from voyeuristic entertainment to something more complex. A young man who had been smirking earlier now watched with unexpected interest. A middle-aged woman lowered her phone, choosing to witness rather than record. A child broke free from parental restraint and edged closer, drawn by the authenticity of the interaction. "You hold like this," Miguel instructed, adjusting Johnny's grip on the fishing rod. "Feel the wind before you cast." Johnny nodded, concentrating. "Like this?" "Yes. Now you listen to water. Watch how it moves. Fish leave signs if you know how to read. Miguel's expertise flowed naturally now, his dignity restored not through confrontation, but through the simple act of sharing knowledge that could not be purchased. Within 30 minutes, a remarkable scene had unfolded on the formerly exclusive beach. Johnny Depp, barefoot and focused, cast a line into the azure waters under Miguel's guidance. 3 resort guests, shoes abandoned, and designer swimwear dampened by sea spray, had joined the impromptu fishing lesson. The child who had questioned her mother earlier now sat cross-legged on the sand as Miguel explained how to identify different fish by their movement patterns beneath the surface. Andre Wilton had retreated to the edge of the scene, phone pressed to his ear as he attempted to explain the situation to his superiors. His carefully maintained order had dissolved, replaced by something unscripted, yet undeniably more alive. "My father catch marlin here, bigger than me," Miguel told his small audience, hands spread wide to indicate the size. Before hotels, before tourists, the fish remember when people forget. A woman who had earlier complained about Miguel's presence now nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather was a fisherman in Maine," she offered unexpectedly. "He always said you don't really know a place until you've harvested food from it." Johnny smiled, not the practiced smile of red carpets, but something genuine. "That's wisdom that crosses oceans," he said, connecting her experience to Miguel's without erasing either. Thomas, the young security guard, had removed his resort cap and stood watching from a respectful distance, the boundary between employee and human visibly blurred in his expression. As sunset painted the sky in colors no resort decorator could specify, Johnny helped Miguel gather his equipment. The crowd had dispersed, though not in the way Andre had initially intended. Some had returned to their expensive accommodations with uncomfortable new awareness. Others had found spots along the beach to watch the fishing lesson conclude, their perception of vacation value subtly but permanently altered. "You come tomorrow?" Miguel asked Johnny, hope evident in the question. Johnny nodded. "I'd like that. Maybe we can convince the chef here to cook whatever we catch." He glanced toward the resort, where Andre stood watching, his defeat now complete, but perhaps not entirely unwelcome. Some burdens, once set down, reveal themselves as liberation. The images and videos captured that afternoon spread across social media with unprecedented speed, not with the hashtags originally intended, but with new ones: #respect, local wisdom, Johnny Depp fishing, Azure Bay reality. The narrative had been rewritten not through confrontation, but through connection, a celebrity choosing authenticity over exclusivity, heritage over amenities. 2 weeks later, Azure Bay Resort unveiled its new Cultural Heritage Program, featuring local fishermen sharing traditional techniques with guests. Miguel Sanchez was listed as the program's primary consultant, his photograph prominently displayed in the resort lobby. The beach access policy had been quietly revised, the boundary between owned and shared subtly renegotiated in recognition of histories longer than property deeds. Some things cannot be purchased: respect, belonging, wisdom. Like the sea itself, they can only be approached with humility and received as gifts.